In this chapter, I would like to speak with you about the actual design of the shelter. Designing a shelter, it's a very unique project. It is very small at the same on one side, but on the other side, it is supposed to optimize the space until its very limits. So we're not designing a big house where anything can happen and the space can be used for anything. We're designing a really minimum living unit, and in this living unit people are supposed to have a decent life, to conduce normal life during many years. Hopefully not that many, but usually camps stay for anywhere between 2, 3, and some of them even more than 10 years. So sometimes there are generations that are born and raised in a refugee camp, unfortunately. So in our shelter, we are supposed to design a shelter that lasts for at least 3 years. So that's why we're not designing with the usual canvas and tarp that UNHCR provides for the emergency response right after a tragedy, in which tent lasts only for 6 weeks. We're designing something that is a transitional shelter and that will last at least for 2 or 3 years. There are a number of guidelines for how to design a shelter, and those are available on our forums. Those are available on a different website, UNHCR, Sphere project, and also the Shelter Center. The website of the Shelter Center has a very extensive library, and I invite you to look into that. When we talk about shelters, you have to understand what are the minimum standards for inhabitation. We know that a person should have at least 3.5 square meters for hot tropical climates, and should have at least 4.5 to 5.5 in cold climates. So according to the place where we design, we have to adapt the design and we have to adapt the shelters. This means that you can either design one shelter, and when it's applied to a hot climate, you can have more people in it, for example 5 to 6 people, and when it's in a colder climate you can have probably 4 to 5 people in it. These standards are designed on the basis of the lifestyle of people in this shelter. In hot climates, usually people only sleep in the shelter, and then they spend most of the day outside of it, in the community, in the communal spaces, outdoors, because the climate allows it. So essentially the shelter is a protection against the elements. It's something that brings people safety, privacy and comfort, but then they spend most of the day in the exterior. In cold climate, it's the opposite. People spend most of the time in the shelter, because outside, when it's cold, it's not quite possible to be in the exterior. So the shelter has to be heated, it has to have the right climate condition in the inside, and it has to be a place where people can spend the entire day, 24 hours of the day. In both cases, we separate everything that is cooking and dining from the shelter. Supposedly people eat in some kind of communal kitchens and common space, and the food is cooked by the staff of the camp and distributed to people. Also, the bathrooms and showers are not inside the shelters, but they are in a separate space. So the shelter is basically mostly used for sleeping, but it should have also a living space for people, for kids to write their homework, or for people just to gather with their community. Shelters are often used for a single family, where all the members of the family live in the same unit, but sometimes, unfortunately, when people are affected by wars or a natural disaster, their family is not with them and they have to share the space with others. So we're talking about a space that is shared either with the extended community or with people who they're not familiar with, but they live in this space together. So this is about the shelter and the minimum surface requirements. the height of the shelter, it's supposed to be at least 2 meters in the lowest spot. So if you have slanted roof, the minimum is 2 meters and the maximum is as high as you want to make it. For hot climates, it's suggested that the shelter is higher so that the air inside can ventilate, and when it warms up, the hot air goes up in the higher part where the ceiling is, so the cooler area next to the floor it's more comfortable and better for living. In cold climates, it's the opposite. The shelters are rather low, because when you warm up the space inside, the less air you have in the interior, the easier it is to warm it up and to provide comfortable temperature. We saw in our previous chapter that there are many ways of designing a shelter. A shelter could be made with local materials, for example, bamboo, wood, leaves of trees, and anything that is even bricks that are made in the community near the camp. Or it could be made prefabricated and somewhere in a factory away from the camp and away from the place where this community has settled. And then what happens is that it's shipped on the site, people assemble it. It should be light enough and easy enough to assemble, so maybe 4 people can build a shelter in a day, because people need them, so it has to be very fast construction. But you have to think also about the transportation and how these shelters are delivered on the site. So if they are made in a factory, they have to be packaged in a way that they can fit in the least possible space. Then they're delivered in boxes to the site and they're assembled. You may think about a shelter in which you have separation between the structure of the unit and the membrane of the unit. As for example, the IKEA shelter that we saw, or as other shelters that we saw designed in Germany and in the Aalto University, where the structure is one piece made out of steel and steel tubes and cables, and then the membrane it's a different part. There's another example of, for example, with Shigeru Ban's paper tube shelters. His shelters are made of tubes which are connected with plastic or wooden joints, and then they're covered with tarp or with some other material. You have different examples of his shelters that we saw in our previous units, so if you haven't been there, I invite you to watch the videos, which will be very helpful for your design. I invite you to use all kinds of possible materials and all different approaches. In this course, we are trying to reinvent the shelter. So remember that we are trying to do something new. We are not just replicating what has been done there before us, and that's why we had the precedent studies, to learn something from them. But now we really want to experiment with new materials, new kinds of spaces, new geometries, and new construction techniques, and to see what we can come up with. The shelters that have been used by UNHCR have been the same in the past 50 years, the same tarp kind of construction, and they're quite outdated. At the time when they started using them, they did the job, but nowadays people need more comfort, and in order for them to be healthy and safe, they need a better design. And that's why I invite you to get together with your team or by yourself and start the design and do something remarkable, incredible, astonishing that you can share with us and inspire us. And please post it on our forum and on our website so we can discuss it together during our virtual meetings. We will be sending also feedback on the forum, on Facebook and on the OED website. So come together and be with us, and let's get this design started. Thank you.